Modest rancher helps grumpy neighbor and falls for the millionaire. Michael Thompson woke up that March Saturday to the deafening noise of heavy machinery coming from the neighboring property. For 3 weeks, ever since the new resident had arrived, his peaceful life in rural Montana had turned into pure torment. "Hey, you there!" An angry woman's voice shouted from the other side of the barbed wire fence separating the two properties. "I need you to take this fence down immediately." Michael set down the bucket of feed he was carrying and walked over to where the woman stood. Even in her irritation, he couldn't help but notice her elegance. She wore a flawless beige pantsuit, completely out of place in the countryside, and her chestnut hair was pulled back into a perfect bun. Everything about her screamed big city and big money. "Good morning, Mom. I'm Michael, your neighbor," he said, politely tipping his brown hat. "Is there a problem with the fence?" "Problem?" She crossed her arms, her dark eyes flashing with annoyance. "This outdated fence is in the way of my machinery. I need it removed today." Michael felt a tightness in his chest. That fence wasn't just a property line. It protected the only clean water well in the area, a source his family had preserved for 3 generations. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this fence protects our well. It's the only drinking water source within 5 miles, he explained, trying to stay calm. "If your machines come through here, they could contaminate the water that supplies the whole community." The woman rolled her eyes dismissively. "I don't care about your well. I bought this property, and I have the right to do what I want. This fence is coming down whether you like it or not. May I ask your name?" Michael pressed, trying to keep the conversation civil. "Elizabeth Carter," she snapped, "and I'm not here to make friends. I came to work." Michael knew that name. The Carters were a prominent family of business people from Denver, owners of one of the state's largest construction firms. But what was a millionaire heiress doing in this forgotten corner of the countryside? "Ms. Elizabeth, I know we don't know each other, but this land has history. My grandfather planted every tree here with future generations in mind. That well," he pointed beyond the fence, "doesn't just supply our property, but also the rural school and the community health clinic." Elizabeth marched over to one of the excavators and shouted something to the operator. Michael watched in horror as the man prepared to tear down the fence. "Miss Elizabeth, please!" Michael rushed toward her. "At least give me time to show you an alternate route. There's another path that won't harm the water supply." "I don't have time for your country stories," she replied with an impatient wave. "Either you take this fence down in 2 hours, or I'll have my men do it." Michael felt his world crumbling. 3 generations of hard work and preservation were about to be destroyed by the whims of a woman who didn't even understand its importance. But there was something in Elizabeth's eyes, beneath all that anger, that intrigued him. It was as if she was running from something, not fighting for it. The next day, Elizabeth appeared on her property even more frustrated. This time she was struggling alone with heavy bags of feed for the thoroughbred horses Michael had seen arriving the day before. "Need some help?" he offered, stepping closer to the fence. "I don't need anyone's help," she replied, clearly straining under the weight of the bags. Michael watched as Elizabeth wrestled with a 20-pound bag, dragging it toward the horse pen. Her designer clothes were smudged with dirt and sweat, and she was breathing hard. He couldn't just stand there and do nothing. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. Without asking permission, Michael jumped over the low fence separating the properties and took the bag from Elizabeth's hands. "I said I don't need help," she protested, trying to pull the bag back. "I know you did, but I can't just stand by and watch a woman struggle like this," Michael replied, carrying the bag effortlessly. "Where do you want me to put it?" Elizabeth stared at him with a mix of anger and confusion. She was used to people either obeying her orders or trying to take advantage of her. But this simple man seemed genuinely concerned, even after she'd been so rude the day before. "Over there by the pen," she murmured, pointing to where the 3 Arabian horses stood. Michael carried all the bags without complaint, while Elizabeth watched in silence. There was something about the way he treated the animals, speaking softly and affectionately to them, that touched her unexpectedly. "Why are you doing this?" she asked when he finished. "Yesterday," I made it very clear, we're neighbors who don't like each other. Michael adjusted his cap and looked her straight in the eye. Because that's how I was raised, Ms. Elizabeth. My mother always said we don't help people because they deserve it, but because we deserve to be better people. For the first time since arriving in that place, Elizabeth was speechless. She turned her back and walked into the house without saying thank you, but something in her rigid posture had shifted. The next morning, Michael was woken by the desperate neighing of Elizabeth's horses. He quickly pulled on a pair of jeans and a flannel shirt and rushed outside. The 3 animals had escaped and were loose in the fields. Elizabeth appeared minutes later, wearing a silk robe over her nightgown, completely frantic. "My horses! Where are my horses?" she shouted, running back and forth. "Calm down, Miss Elizabeth, I'll help look for them," Michael said, already pulling on his boots. "You!" She turned to him, eyes flashing. "I'm sure you were the one who let them out. You want revenge because I didn't remove that fence." Michael felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. Even after constantly trying to help her, Elizabeth still thought the worst of him. "Miss Elizabeth, I would never hurt an animal, and I'd certainly never do anything to harm you even after everything." "Liar!" she yelled, tears of anger in her eyes. "People like you always want something in return." Michael took a deep breath, swallowed his hurt and headed for the gate. "I'll find your horses. I know every inch of this land. If they're lost out here, I'll bring them back." He walked off into the still dark fields, following the animals' tracks. Elizabeth stood frozen, watching his silhouette disappear into the morning mist, feeling strangely regretful for the harsh words she'd spoken. Michael spent 3 hours searching for the horses. When he finally found them, they were trapped in a depression in the ground, frightened and injured. With patience, he calmed them and led them back. When he returned to Elizabeth's property with the 3 animals, he found 2 men in black suits talking to her on the porch. They were clearly private security. "Are these your horses?" Michael asked cautiously as he approached. One of the guards immediately stepped between Michael and Elizabeth. "Keep your distance," the man said, his hand moving toward his chest where he likely carried a weapon. "He brought my horses back," Elizabeth said, but her voice sounded strange, almost ashamed. Michael handed the reins to the worker who appeared and turned to leave, but Elizabeth called out to him. "Michael, where did you find them?" "They were stuck in a hollow about 2 kilometers from here. I think something spooked them during the night and they ran off," he explained, avoiding mentioning the injuries so as not to worry her further. "I've already tended to their wounds. They'll be fine." Elizabeth observed the horses and noticed someone had indeed carefully treated the cuts. Pieces of clean cloth were tied around the animals' legs. She recognized the fabric as coming from the checkered shirt Michael had worn the day before. You tore your own clothes to take care of them," Michael shrugged. It wasn't anything important. At that moment, Elizabeth realized she had hired security guards to watch over a man who had just sacrificed his own clothing to care for her animals. The shame she felt was so intense, she had to steady herself against the porch railing. For the entire week, the guards remained stationed on the property. Michael continued his usual routine, but could feel their suspicious gazes on him. Elizabeth barely left the house, and when she did, she avoided looking toward the neighboring property. On Friday, a violent storm hit the area. Winds of over 60 miles per hour tore shingles from Elizabeth's roof and toppled a century-old tree in the yard. Michael saw it all from his window and, without a second thought, grabbed his tools and ran to help. "Sir, you can't go through," one of the guards said, blocking his path. "Ms. Elizabeth's roof is damaged. I need to help," Michael insisted, the rain soaking his clothes. "The lady hasn't authorized you to enter the property." Michael looked toward the house and saw Elizabeth at the window watching the scene. Their eyes met for a moment, and he saw something different in hers, no longer anger or distrust, but confusion. "Then I'll help from out here," Michael said. Throughout the storm, he worked from outside the fence, repairing what he could reach of Elizabeth's roof. The guards watched but couldn't stop him from working on his own property, even if it was to help his neighbor. Elizabeth stayed at the window all night, watching this man labor in the pouring rain to fix her home. At one point, she noticed he had climbed onto his own roof and was removing new shingles. "What are you doing?" she shouted from the window, unable to hold back. "Your shingles are all gone," Michael called back, still pulling shingles from his own house. "I'm using mine to patch the biggest hole." Elizabeth felt tears mixing with the rain coming through the window. This man was literally stripping his own roof to protect hers. She ran to the door and shouted at the guards, "Let him in, now!" But when the guards stepped aside, Michael shook his head. "I don't need to come in, Miss Elizabeth. I can finish from here," he said, continuing his work even as he shivered from the cold. In the early hours of the morning, when the storm finally passed, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about every gesture Michael had made since his arrival. He had asked for nothing in return, never boasted about his actions, and even when rejected and humiliated, he kept helping. By morning, Elizabeth discovered Michael had used all the spare shingles from his own house to repair her roof. His simple home now had leaks in 3 rooms, while hers was completely protected. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. 3 days after the storm, an elegant woman around 60 years old arrived at Elizabeth's property in an imported car. Michael saw her from his window and immediately recognized the aristocratic bearing of the visitor. "Elizabeth, my dear cousin," the woman shouted, stepping out of the car with her arms wide open. Elizabeth came out of the house with a look of surprise and something that seemed like panic. "Cousin Jennifer, what are you doing here?" "I came to get you, obviously. You've hidden away long enough in this middle of nowhere," Jennifer said, hugging Elizabeth tightly. "Our whole family is worried about you." Michael couldn't help but overhear the conversation, since the 2 women were talking loudly in the neighboring yard. "How did you find me?" Elizabeth asked, clearly nervous. "Please, sweetheart, it wasn't that hard to track your credit card expenses. A farm in rural Montana? What got into you?" Jennifer stopped talking when she noticed Michael working in his garden. "My God, Michael Thompson, is that really you?" Michael dropped the hoe and walked to the fence, surprised to be recognized. "Miss Jennifer, you know my name." "Know it? Young man, you saved my life 15 years ago," Jennifer exclaimed, emotional. "I was a foolish 45-year-old who decided to swim in the river after a heavy lunch. If you hadn't pulled me out when I started drowning..." Elizabeth looked from Michael to Jennifer, completely lost. "You 2 know each other?" "Elizabeth, this man is a hero," Jennifer said, pointing at Michael. "Back then, I was visiting a friend in the area. I decided to play adventurer and nearly drowned. Michael was only 20 and risked his own life to save me." Michael blushed and lowered his head. "It was nothing, Miss Jennifer. Anyone would have done the same." "Not just anyone, dear. Most would have stood there watching," Jennifer retorted, turning to Elizabeth. "And you're telling me this angel of a person is your neighbor and you 2 don't talk?" Elizabeth was in shock. The man she'd treated with such disdain was known in the area for saving lives. How had she misjudged someone so badly? "Cousin Jennifer," Elizabeth said, trying to change the subject, "what did you mean by hidden away long enough?" Jennifer realized she'd said too much in front of Michael and lowered her voice. "Sweetheart, we all know about the scandal with your business partner, about the embezzled money and, well, about Robert." Michael pretended to focus on his garden, but couldn't help noticing how Elizabeth paled at hearing that name. "I don't want to talk about it," Elizabeth murmured. "But you need to come home. You can't hide here forever," Jennifer insisted. "I'm not hiding," Elizabeth lied. "I'm renovating this property." Jennifer looked around and saw the idle machinery, the security guards scattered across the property, and the tension in the air. "Renovating what exactly? And why do you need security guards to renovate a farm?" Elizabeth didn't know how to respond. Michael, sensing her discomfort, stepped closer to the fence. "Ms. Jennifer, if I may, your cousin is doing excellent work here. She's brought progress to our area," he said, lying to protect Elizabeth. Jennifer looked from Michael to Elizabeth with a sly smile. "I see. Progress," she said, emphasizing the word. "Elizabeth, can we talk in private?" The 2 walked away, but Michael caught fragments of their conversation. Words like betrayal, bankrupt company, and broken heart reached his ears. He began to understand why Elizabeth was so bitter and distrustful. When Jennifer left that afternoon, promising to return the following week, Elizabeth grew even more agitated and nervous. Michael watched her pacing back and forth in the yard, muttering to herself and gesturing. 2 weeks later, Michael came down with a high fever that wouldn't go away. He tried to keep working, but ended up collapsing in the middle of the garden. Mrs. Grace, his housekeeper who came twice a week, found him and immediately called Dr. Williams, the only doctor in the area. "Michael is very sick," the doctor told Mrs. Grace. "He has a severe case of pneumonia, probably from working in the rain last week. He needs expensive antibiotics and complete rest." "But doctor, he doesn't have the money for those expensive medicines," Mrs. Grace lamented. "Then we'll have to try with what we have available at the health clinic, but I can't guarantee it'll be enough." The news spread quickly through the small community. Within hours, neighbors began arriving at Michael's property offering help. Mrs. Johnson brought homemade soup, old Jack volunteered to take care of the animals, and the rural school teacher organized a raffle to raise money for the medicine. Elizabeth learned about the situation through Mrs. Grace, who also worked in her home twice a week. "The boy is in a bad way, Miss Elizabeth," the housekeeper said, tears in her eyes. 3 days of high fever and that terrible cough. The doctor said he needs medicine that costs over $500, but Michael spent all his savings." Mrs. Grace stopped abruptly, realizing she shouldn't have said that. "Spent it on what?" Elizabeth asked. "I can't say, Miss Elizabeth. It's not my place," the housekeeper murmured, clearly uncomfortable. "Grace, please, I need to know." The woman sighed deeply. "He found out you were having money troubles. He heard that man in a suit demanding payment from you last week. Michael asked me to give you this envelope but told me not to say it was from him." Mrs. Grace pulled a yellowed envelope from her apron. Elizabeth opened it with trembling hands and found exactly $500 in old bills, along with a handwritten note. "Ms. Elizabeth, I know you don't accept help, but everyone deserves a second chance. Use this money however you see fit. Don't worry about paying it back. A neighbor who cares." Elizabeth felt her legs weaken. She sank heavily into the kitchen chair, staring at the money, all of Michael's savings. "Grace, when did he give me this money?" "A week ago, Miss Elizabeth, 2 days after that man came to collect the debt." Elizabeth remembered that day clearly. A debt collector had shown up at her property, demanding payment for a $50,000 debt related to the renovations she was doing. She had managed to negotiate another month's extension, but had been desperate, unsure how she'd pay. And Michael, who had witnessed that humiliating argument, had given her his entire savings to help. "Grace, this money Michael spent, what was it for?" "To fix his parents' house, Miss Elizabeth. The roof where they live is nearly collapsing. Michael saved for 2 years to give them a better home." Elizabeth broke into tears. She cried as she hadn't in years, with sobs that came from the depths of her soul. Michael had sacrificed his dream of giving his parents dignity to help a woman who had treated him poorly. That same afternoon, Elizabeth went to the town pharmacy and bought all the medicine Michael needed. She also paid for private consultations with a pulmonologist from the capital who could see him at home. "Was it you who paid for all this?" the pharmacist, Dr. Johnson, asked when Elizabeth returned for more medicine. "Please, don't tell anyone," Elizabeth requested. "I'm sorry, Miss Elizabeth, but Michael already knows." Mrs. Grace couldn't lie when he asked who had paid. "In fact, he said he wants to speak with you as soon as he's better." Elizabeth felt a mix of relief and nervousness. Part of her wanted to rush to Michael's house and apologize for everything, but her pride still resisted. 3 days later, Michael appeared at Elizabeth's property. He was still pale and thinner, but his eyes shone with determination. Elizabeth saw him approaching and stepped out of the house before he reached the door. "How are you feeling?" she asked, trying to hide her nervousness. "Better, thank you. I came to thank you for the medicine and return this," he said, holding out an envelope with the $500 she had refused earlier. "Michael, I won't take this money back." "Miss Elizabeth, I can't accept charity, and I can't accept you sacrificing your dreams for my sake," she retorted, surprising herself with her own honesty. Michael looked at her intently. "Mrs. Grace told me about your parents and the house repairs," Elizabeth continued. "I know this money was meant to give them a better life. My parents will be fine. They always have been. But you needed it more at the time." Elizabeth felt tears threatening to fall again. Why did you do this? After everything I said, after how I treated you?" Michael sighed and gazed at the fields in the distance. "Because everyone deserves a second chance, Miss Elizabeth. I don't know what happened to you in the past, but I know the person I see helping Mrs. Grace with her groceries, who treats animals with kindness, and who stays up late reading on the porch, isn't a bad person. You've been watching me." Michael blushed. "Not in a bad way. It's just, our houses are close. Sometimes I see your bedroom light on late at night, and I worry if everything's all right." That innocent confession touched Elizabeth more than any romantic declaration could have. For years, no one had genuinely cared about her well-being. "Michael, I need to tell you some things. About why I'm here. About the security guards. About everything. You don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to, Miss Elizabeth. But I want to," she said, surprising herself. "I want you to understand." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. They walked to Elizabeth's porch and sat in the rocking chairs she had bought the week before. It was the first time Michael had entered her property without coming to work or help in an emergency. "My company went bankrupt 3 months ago," Elizabeth began, staring at her hands. "My business partner, who was also my fiancé, embezzled millions of dollars and fled the country. I found out everything in a single day, the financial betrayal and the romantic one." Michael listened quietly, seeing how hard it was for her to talk about it. "I lost everything. The company I built over 15 years, my reputation, my money, and the person I thought I loved. The media destroyed my image, painting me as an accomplice to the scheme." "Is that why you came here?" "I ran away," she admitted. "I bought this property in a desperate attempt to start over, but I brought all my anger and distrust with me. When you showed up being kind, I thought you were just another person trying to take advantage of my situation." Michael shook his head. "I'm so sorry for what you went through. It must have been terrible to discover all that at once. You don't judge me? You don't think I'm an incompetent businesswoman who let herself be fooled? I think you're a strong woman who went through something very difficult and reacted the way anyone would," Michael said. "And I think you came to the right place to heal." Elizabeth looked at him in surprise. "The right place? This land has something special, Ms. Elizabeth. It always has. My grandfather used to say the land heals the wounds life opens in people's hearts. I think you'll discover that too." At that moment, a black car came up the dirt road toward the property. Elizabeth tensed immediately. "Are you expecting someone?" Michael asked. "No," she replied, already standing up. "And when cars show up like this unannounced, it's usually not good news." A man in a suit stepped out of the car. It was Richard Montgomery, an investor from New York, who had lent money to Elizabeth to start the work on the ranch. "Miss Elizabeth," the man said, approaching the porch, "I've come to collect our debt in person." Michael immediately noticed Elizabeth's nervousness. Her fists clenched and her breathing quickened. "Mr. Richard, I still have 2 weeks left of the deadline we agreed on," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You did. But things have changed," Richard retorted, pulling some papers from his jacket's inner pocket. "I found out about your troubles with the company in Denver. Your credit history is no longer reliable." "My record is clean. I owe nothing to anyone but you." Richard laughed unpleasantly. "For now. But I have information that other creditors are after you too. I'd rather secure my payment before they get to you." Michael watched the exchange, seeing how Elizabeth was being intimidated. Richard was the kind of man he knew all too well, the type who used financial power to humiliate others. "How much does she owe you?" Michael asked, standing up. Richard looked him up and down with disdain. "And who exactly are you?" "I'm Miss Elizabeth's neighbor." "Then it's none of your business," Richard said. "Elizabeth, I need $200,000 by Friday, or I'll foreclose on the collateral you gave me." "What collateral?" Michael asked. "This property," Richard replied with a cruel smile. "If she doesn't pay, the ranch becomes mine." Elizabeth turned pale. Michael realized she hadn't mentioned this collateral when she took the loan. "Mr. Richard," Michael said, "would it be possible to split the payment?" Do you have $200,000 to lend your little friend? Richard mocked. Michael didn't even have $10,000 in the bank, but something inside him rebelled against the way this man was treating Elizabeth. Maybe we can find a solution that works for everyone. Richard burst out laughing. What solution? You strike me as some broke country boy trying to play the hero. I'm a rancher, and you might be surprised by what I can offer. Elizabeth looked at Michael in panic. She didn't want him involved in her financial troubles, especially after he'd already given her his savings to help. Michael, don't get into this, she whispered, but Michael had already made up his mind. He couldn't stand by and watch Elizabeth be humiliated the same way he'd been humiliated so many times by people who thought money gave them the right to mistreat others. Mr. Richard, I have a proposal. If you give me 2 months, I can gather $150,000 for Ms. Elizabeth. Michael, have you lost your mind? Elizabeth whispered. Richard seemed intrigued. How? Selling corn? He asked, still mocking. Selling my land, Michael replied calmly. The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth jumped to her feet. No, Michael, you can't sell your land because of me. It's my decision, he said, looking straight at Richard. Will you accept $150,000 in 2 months and forgive the other 50? Richard thought for a few seconds. It was more money than he'd get if he foreclosed and auctioned Elizabeth's property. $70,000 forgiven, not 50. And I want proof that you're selling your land. Michael, this is madness, Elizabeth was nearly shouting. I won't let you sell your family's land for me. Michael looked at her with a calm he didn't feel. Miss Elizabeth, this is my choice. And it's also my way of proving that not everyone has ulterior motives when they offer help. Richard pulled out a pre-written document from his briefcase. I'll draw up a contract. You have until Friday to sign and file the paperwork for the sale of your property, he said to Michael. If you don't comply, I can still enforce the lien on hers. After Richard left, Elizabeth and Michael stood in silence on the porch. The weight of the decision Michael had made hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Why did you do this? Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling. Because I couldn't let you lose your land, the same way I almost lost mine when my father got sick 5 years ago, Michael replied. I know what it's like to lie awake at night, afraid of losing the place where you grew up. Elizabeth turned to him, tears in her eyes. But you're going to lose your land because of me. Don't you see that's worse for me than losing mine? Michael looked at her in surprise. Why would it be worse? Because... Elizabeth couldn't finish the sentence. How could she explain that in just a few weeks he had become the most important person in her life? How could she say that the thought of him sacrificing everything for her was tearing her apart inside? That night, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. She stayed on the porch, watching the light in Michael's house burn late into the night, knowing he was awake too, probably thinking about how to explain to his parents that he'd have to sell the family property. The next morning, Elizabeth made a decision. She called cousin Jennifer. Jennifer, I need a huge favor, she said, barely waiting for her cousin to answer. Elizabeth, it's so good to hear your voice. Of course, anything. I need you to lend me $200,000. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Elizabeth, you know I'd give you my soul if I could, but I don't have that much cash on hand. I'd have to sell some investments, and that takes a few days. How many days? At least a week. Why the urgency? Elizabeth told Jennifer the whole situation, including Michael's offer to sell his property. My God, Elizabeth, that man is in love with you. Don't be ridiculous, Jennifer. He's just being kind. Kind? Honey, no man sells his family's land out of kindness. He's head over heels for you, and you're too blind to see it. Elizabeth fell silent, processing her cousin's words. Even if that were true, I can't let him do this. Then don't. Find a way to stop him. How? I don't know, Elizabeth, but if you don't do something, you'll spend the rest of your life knowing the man you loved lost everything because of you. I never said I love him. You didn't have to. It's in your voice. After hanging up, Elizabeth stood frozen in the middle of the room, feeling as if the world were collapsing. Jennifer was right. She had fallen in love with Michael, and he was about to sacrifice everything for her. She decided to go to his house and try to talk him out of it. She found him in the yard, fixing a fence damaged in the storm. "Michael, we need to talk," she said as she approached. "About what?" "About this madness of selling your property. I won't allow it." Michael stopped working and looked at her. "With all due respect, Miss Elizabeth, but it's not your decision." "Of course it is. It's because of me." "It's because of me too," he said calmly. "I couldn't live with myself knowing I could have helped and did nothing." Elizabeth felt frustration rising. "Michael, you don't understand. I don't deserve this sacrifice. I'm not a good person. I've been rude, ungrateful, distrustful." "Were," he corrected. "In the past. The person I see now is different." "How can you be so sure?" Michael set down his tools and stepped closer. "Because I saw you crying when Mrs. Grace told you her son was unemployed. I saw you leaving food on the porch for that stray dog that showed up last week. I saw you paying Mr. Jack at the pharmacy, thinking no one was watching." Elizabeth was surprised. She didn't know he had noticed those small kindnesses. "These are little gestures. They don't make up for all the harm I've caused." "To me they do," said Michael. "And if I've decided to sell my land, it's because I believe you're worth that sacrifice." His words struck Elizabeth like lightning. For the first time, someone was telling her she was worth something, not for the money she had or the business she'd built, but simply for who she was. "I don't want you to do that," she murmured, her voice choked. "And I don't want you to lose your land," he replied. They stared at each other for long seconds, both knowing there was much more being said in those simple words. "Michael, what if I found another way to get the money?" "How?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. There was one possibility she had tried to avoid until now. "I could sell my house in Denver. It's a large property in an upscale neighborhood. It must be worth at least $300,000. "Why didn't you do that before?" "Because it's the only thing I have left from my old life. It's where I planned to return when all this was over," she admitted. "But I realized maybe I don't want to go back anymore." Michael looked at her intently. "What do you mean?" Elizabeth glanced around, taking in the golden fields, the distant mountains, the quiet simplicity of that place. "It means that for the first time in years I feel at peace, and it's not because of the place. It's because of the people." "The people?" "You," she said, finally admitting it to herself and to him. The silence that followed was heavy with tension and possibility. Michael took a step toward her. "Elizabeth, don't say anything yet," she pleaded. "First, let me settle this situation with Richard. Then we can talk about us." Michael nodded, but his eyes shone with a hope he didn't try to hide. That afternoon, Elizabeth called a real estate agency in Denver and put her house up for sale. The agent said that due to the urgency, she'd have to accept a below-market price, but it would still be enough to pay Richard and leave some extra. 2 days later, an interested buyer appeared. Elizabeth would have to go to Denver to sign the papers and handle the legal matters. "I'll be gone for 3 days," she told Michael. "Do you want me to take care of your horses?" "I'd like you to take care of much more than that," she said, immediately blushing at her own boldness. Michael smiled. "I'll take care of everything here. Don't worry." The night before her trip, Elizabeth was packing some clothes when she heard frantic knocking at the door. It was Mrs. Grace, her face red from running. Miss Elizabeth, something terrible has happened." "What is it, Grace?" "It's Michael's mother. She fainted at home and won't wake up. Dr. Williams said she needs to go to the hospital in the capital right away." Elizabeth's heart raced. "How's Michael?" "Desperate. He doesn't have the money to take his mother privately to Denver, and the Medicare ambulance won't come until tomorrow." Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She ran to her room, grabbed all the emergency money she had saved, about $8,000, and rushed to Michael's house. She found him on the porch, his head in his hands, while his elderly father wept beside him. "Michael," she called. "Elizabeth? I thought you'd already left." "I came to give you this," she said, handing him the envelope with the money. "To take your mother to the hospital." Michael looked at the money, then at her. "I can't accept this. You need this money for your trip." "I need your mother to be okay," she said simply. "We'll figure out the rest later." "Elizabeth." "Don't argue with me now, Michael. Your mother needs urgent care. Michael took the money with trembling hands. How will I ever repay you? You've already repaid me weeks ago. Michael looked at her, confused. You taught me that there are still good people in this world, Elizabeth explained. That's priceless. 2 hours later, Michael left for Denver with his mother in a private car. Elizabeth cancelled her trip and stayed to care for his father, Mr. Anthony, a 75-year-old man who was devastated with worry. Ms. Elizabeth, Mr. Anthony said that night as she made soup for him, may I ask you something? Of course, old Anthony. Do you like my son? Elizabeth stopped stirring the soup. Why do you ask? Because in 50 years of marriage, I've learned to recognize when a woman is in love. And you have the same look in your eyes that my wife had when she looked at me. Elizabeth felt tears burning her eyes. Your Michael is a special man. He is, but he's also stubborn and very proud. If you want to win his heart for good, you'll have to be more direct. What do you mean? Mr. Anthony smiled. I mean my son would never confess his feelings to a woman he thinks is far above him socially. He'll admire her from afar until she gets tired and leaves. Elizabeth processed those words. It made sense. Michael always treated her with near reverential respect, as if she were untouchable. What do you suggest I do? Show him your equals. That money doesn't define a person's worth. For the 3 days Michael was gone, Elizabeth cared not only for his father, but also for the property. She fed the animals, watered the garden, fixed a loose fence. Her hands grew calloused and dirty, her clothes stained with dirt, but she had never felt so useful and fulfilled. On the 3rd day, Mrs. Grace found her kneeling in the garden, planting herbs. Ms. Elizabeth, what are you doing? Planting basil, she replied, showing the seedlings. Michael said he wanted to plant some but didn't have time before his trip. But you don't have to do this, I can tend the garden. I want to, Grace. It makes me happy. Grace watched her for a few minutes. Ms. Elizabeth, can I say something? Of course. You've changed a lot since you got here. For better or worse? For better, definitely. You're more human, more like one of us. Elizabeth smiled, continuing to plant. I think I'm finally learning what really matters in life. By evening, Elizabeth saw Michael's car coming up the road. She stood from the garden, wiped her hands on her dirty jeans, and ran to greet him. How's your mother? She asked, before he even stepped out of the car. Fine, thank God, it was a scare, but she'll be okay, Michael answered, looking exhausted. And you? How are you? He looked her up and down, noticing her dirt-stained clothes, messy hair, and calloused hands. What happened to you? Elizabeth glanced at herself and laughed. I discovered I like working the land. You tended my garden? And your animals and your house and your father, she said. I hope you don't mind. Michael walked to the garden and saw the perfectly planted rows of basil. Elizabeth, you didn't have to. Yes, I did, she interrupted. I needed to prove to myself that I can be useful without money, without staff, with nothing but my own 2 hands. Michael turned to her, and for the first time since they'd met, Elizabeth saw something different in his eyes. No longer respectful admiration, something deeper and more equal. You planted exactly where I planned to, he said, amazed. Maybe because we think alike, she replied. They stood there in the middle of the garden, dirt on their feet and sweat on their faces, looking at each other as if seeing one another for the first time. Elizabeth, I need to tell you something, Michael said. What? While I was at the hospital with my mother, I had a lot of time to think. About us, about everything that happened. Elizabeth felt her heart race. And what did you conclude? That I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just friendship. His confession came out like a sigh, heavy with vulnerability and fear. Michael, I know we're very different, he continued quickly, as if afraid she might interrupt. I know you have a world out there, a life I don't understand, but I also know that when I'm with you, I feel like I've found my place in the world. Elizabeth took a step toward him. Do you want to know what I realized while you were away? What? That I found my place in the world too, and it's right here, beside you. with dirt on my hands and peace in my heart." Michael looked at her as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Are you sure? You won't regret it when the novelty wears off?" In response, Elizabeth knelt in the dirt and plucked a handful of basil she had planted. "See this?" she said, holding up the seedlings. "I planted each one of these with my own hands, thinking of you. Every little leaf that grows here will be proof that I chose to stay." Michael knelt beside her, taking her dirt-stained hands. "Elizabeth, are you sure? Because if you say yes now, I won't be able to let you go." "Then you'd better not try," she replied, intertwining her fingers with his. Michael pulled her closer, and finally, among the basil plants under the golden evening sky, they kissed. It was a kiss that tasted like earth, sweat, honest work, and true love. When they pulled apart, they were both laughing and crying at the same time. "I still have to settle things with Richard," Elizabeth reminded him. "We'll handle it together," Michael said. "From now on, everything that's yours is mine too, and everything that's mine is yours." "Even your basil garden?" "Especially my basil garden," he answered, kissing her again. 2 weeks later, Elizabeth managed to sell her house in Denver and pay off her debt to Richard. With the money left over, she and Michael became partners in a small organic farming business that supplied restaurants in the city. Jennifer came to visit a month later and found Elizabeth in jeans, a t-shirt and boots, helping Michael harvest tomatoes. "My goodness, Elizabeth, you've turned into a country girl," Jennifer exclaimed. "I've turned into a happy woman," Elizabeth corrected, proudly showing her calloused hands. "And Michael, where's that neighbor who saved my life?" "Right over there," Elizabeth said, pointing to Michael, who was talking with Mr. Anthony about the garden's irrigation. "Now he saves my life every day." "How so?" "He saved me from an empty life, full of money but no meaning. He taught me that true wealth isn't in what you have but in what you can give." Jennifer watched the couple working together, seeing how perfectly they complemented each other. "And are you two getting married?" Elizabeth smiled, discreetly touching her stomach. "We are in 2 months, and you'll be the maid of honors and also an aunt." "An aunt? Elizabeth, are you—" "2 months pregnant," Elizabeth confirmed, beaming. "I found out last week." Jennifer shrieked with joy and hugged her cousin. "Does Michael know?" "I'll tell him tonight. I was waiting for the right moment." "And what would the right moment be?" Elizabeth looked around at the lush garden, the simple but cozy house, Michael laughing with his father, the golden sunset casting everything in a magical glow. "I think any moment here is the right moment. I finally understand that happiness isn't in grand gestures or big achievements. It's in the small moments of peace and love." That night, after dinner, Elizabeth and Michael walked to the spot where she had planted the basil. The little plant had grown, filling the night air with its sweet fragrance. "Michael, I have news for you," she said, taking his hands. "Good or bad?" "The best possible," she replied, placing his hands on her belly. "We're having a baby." Michael stood still for a few seconds, processing the information. Then a huge smile spread across his face. "A baby? Our baby?" "Our baby," she confirmed. Michael lifted her off the ground and spun her in the air, both laughing and crying with happiness. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" he asked, carefully setting her back down. "We don't know yet, but I already know what I want to name them." "What? If it's a girl, Hope. If it's a boy, Anthony, like your father." Michael kissed her with infinite tenderness. "Elizabeth, you've made me the happiest man in the world, and you've taught me that the world can be a good place when we have the right people by our side." 6 months later, Elizabeth and Michael married in a simple ceremony at the town church. The entire community was there, including Mrs. Grace, who cried throughout the ceremony, and Mr. Anthony, who walked Elizabeth down the aisle. The bride wore a simple white cotton dress she had sewn herself and carried a bouquet of basil from the garden they had planted together. Michael wore a suit borrowed from Dr. Williams, but looked more elegant than any millionaire Elizabeth had ever met. "Do you promise to love each other in wealth and poverty, in sickness and in health, in good times and in hardship?" asked the priest. "We do," they answered together, looking into each other's eyes. "Then, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The kiss that sealed their union was met with applause from everyone present, but for Elizabeth and Michael, only the two of them existed in that moment. 3 months later, Hope Thompson Carter was born, a little girl with dark eyes like her mother's and a sweet smile like her father's. Elizabeth was feeding their daughter on the porch when she spotted a familiar car coming up the road. It was Richard Montgomery. Michael stepped outside as the car approached. "What does that man want here?" Elizabeth asked, worried. "We're about to find out," Michael replied, positioning himself protectively between Richard and his family. Richard stepped out of the car with an expression very different from the last time he had been there. He looked embarrassed and nervous. "Michael, Elizabeth," he greeted, tipping his hat. "Mr. Richard?" Michael replied coldly. "What can we do for you?" "Actually, I came here to help you," Richard said, surprising the couple. "How so?" Elizabeth asked. Richard took a deep breath. "I found out you've been supplying organic products to some restaurants in the city. I own a chain of restaurants in 3 states and would like to make a partnership proposal." Michael and Elizabeth exchanged glances, skeptical. "What kind of partnership?" Michael asked. "I want you to become my exclusive suppliers of organic products. It's a 5-year contract with upfront payment for the first year." "And why are you offering this to us?" Elizabeth questioned. Richard seemed even more embarrassed. Because after I left here last time, I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw. How you supported each other, how the community came together for you. It made me realize I've been living my whole life the wrong way." "How so?" Michael asked. "I always thought money and power were everything. But you showed me there are more important things, and I want a chance to do things right this time." Elizabeth looked at Michael, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "We'll hear your proposal," she said. Richard explained the contract details. It was a generous offer that would allow Michael and Elizabeth to expand their production significantly and hire other families in the area. "Why are you doing this?" Elizabeth asked when he finished. "Because you taught me that making money by exploiting others' hardships doesn't bring happiness. I want to try to build something that's good for everyone involved." Michael and Elizabeth spoke privately and decided to accept the offer, but with one condition. Part of the profits would be invested in an agricultural school for the community. "I accept," said Richard immediately. "In fact, I'd like to personally contribute to that school as well." 2 years later, the agricultural school was up and running and had already graduated its first class of young farmers. Elizabeth had become a teacher of farm management, while Michael taught organic farming techniques. Hope, now 3 years old, ran through the school's halls and knew every plant in the garden by name. She had just gained a baby brother, Anthony, who slept peacefully in the crib beside the desk where Elizabeth graded her students' papers. "Love," Michael called as he entered the room. "Hi," Elizabeth replied, standing to kiss him. "A letter came from the city council. They want to honor us as exemplary citizens of the town." Elizabeth laughed. "Exemplary citizens? Me, who arrived here as the grumpiest neighbor in history?" "You weren't grumpy. You were hurt," Michael corrected, embracing her from behind. "And wounds heal when they find the right remedy." "And what was my remedy?" "Love, patience, and a whole lot of basil," he answered, making her laugh. Elizabeth turned in his arms and looked out the window. She saw the school students tending the garden, the community's children playing in the yard, Mr. Anthony telling stories to a group of grandchildren he had adopted in his heart. "Michael, do you regret anything?" "Taking so long to plant basil," he answered without hesitation. "Why?" "Because it was while planting basil that I found the real you. Not the wealthy, well-dressed woman, but the Elizabeth with dirty hands and an open heart." Elizabeth was moved. "And I found the real Michael when I learned that greatness has nothing to do with money, but with character." They stood embraced, watching the peaceful rhythm of the school and the community they had helped build. "You know what moves me the most?" Elizabeth said. "What?" "Seeing that our story doesn't end with us. It's spreading. Every student we teach carries a bit of that hope to their family, to their land." "That's how the world changes," Michael agreed. "One person at a time, one family at a time." Hope ran into the room just then, her hands covered in dirt and a radiant smile on her face. "Mommy, Daddy, I planted carrots." "You did?" Elizabeth asked, kneeling to her daughter's level. "Yes, Aunt Grace taught me. Look at my hands," the girl said proudly, showing her dirty palms. Michael and Elizabeth exchanged a glance and smiled. Their daughter was learning from an early age the value of honest work and the joy of watching things grow. "You know what this means?" Michael said to Hope. "What, Daddy?" "That in a few months we'll have fresh carrots to eat." "And I planted them." "Me," the girl said, clapping her hands. "You planted them," Elizabeth confirmed, kissing her daughter's forehead. "And when they grow, we'll remember it was you who put the little seed in the ground with love." That night, after putting the children to bed, Elizabeth and Michael went for a walk around the property. It was a habit they had developed, this quiet moment of conversation under the stars. "Michael, can I ask you something?" Elizabeth said as they walked between the crops. "Always. Did you ever imagine your life would be like this?" Michael thought for a few seconds. "Not in this exact way, but I always dreamed of building something bigger than myself. I think we've managed to do that." "How so?" "Look around," he said, pointing to the houses in the community, where lights were still on and families were gathered. "When we started, it was just two neighbors who barely spoke. Today, we're part of an entire community that grew with us." Elizabeth followed his gaze and saw what he was seeing. The school they had built had attracted other families to the area. The health clinic had been expanded. A small cooperative of organic producers was up and running. There was life, hope, and prosperity where there had once been empty land. "Do you know what makes me proudest?" Elizabeth said. "What?" "That our children will grow up seeing it's possible to build a good life without stepping on anyone. They'll learn that real success is when everyone grows together." Michael stopped walking and pulled her into a hug. "Elizabeth, I love you more every day." "Why?" "Because you never stop dreaming. Even after achieving everything we wanted, you keep thinking of ways to make things even better for everyone." "I learned from you," she said. "When I met you, you were already doing that. You cared about clean water for the whole community, not just yourself." They walked home hand in hand, planning new projects and dreaming of their children's future. 5 years later, Hope was 8 and Anthony was 5. The agricultural school had become a national model for sustainable education, and students came from all over the country to learn the methods Michael and Elizabeth had developed. It was the eve of the couple's wedding anniversary, and the community had organized a surprise celebration. Elizabeth had no idea and found it odd when Michael insisted they just take a walk to the school in the late afternoon. When they arrived, they found the entire community gathered in the courtyard with a large banner that read, "Thank you, Michael and Elizabeth, for teaching us that love changes everything." Elizabeth was moved to tears. She saw familiar faces from every family that had benefited in some way from the projects they'd developed together. "Did you all do this?" she asked, still in shock. "It was Hope's idea," said Mrs. Grace, now the school's administrative director. "She said she wanted to thank her parents for making everyone's lives happier." Hope approached, holding a small potted plant. "Mom, Dad, this is for you," she said, handing it over. "What is it?" Michael asked. "Basil," the girl replied proudly. "I planted it myself to remind you of how everything started." Elizabeth and Michael exchanged a glance, remembering that afternoon years ago when they'd planted basil together for the first time, and realized they were in love. "Thank you, sweetheart," Elizabeth said, hugging her daughter. The school's music teacher began playing guitar, and the whole community sang happy anniversary to the couple. Then, one by one, each family came forward to thank Michael and Elizabeth for something specific they'd done for them. Old Jack, who now ran a thriving organic dairy business, said, "You taught me it's never too late to start over." Mrs. Johnson, who had become an expert in medicinal plants, added, "You showed me traditional knowledge has value too." Dr. Williams, who now ran a model community health clinic, declared, "You proved progress and tradition can go hand in hand." One by one, community members shared how their lives had changed for the better after Michael and Elizabeth became partners in life and work. When everyone had finished, Michael spoke up. "When I was a boy," he began, "my grandfather told me a person is only truly rich when they can make others' lives easier. For a long time, I didn't understand what he meant." Michael looked at Elizabeth and smiled. Until I met Elizabeth and discovered that true wealth isn't in what you can accumulate, but in what you can plant. And I'm not just talking about plants, he said, drawing laughter from the audience. I'm talking about dreams, hope, possibilities. Elizabeth stood up and asked to speak as well. When I first arrived here, she said, her voice trembling, I was running from a life that had fallen apart. I was angry at the world, at people, at myself. I thought I couldn't trust anyone. She looked at Michael. Until I met a man who insisted on being kind to me, even when I didn't deserve it. Who taught me that kindness isn't weakness, it's strength. Who showed me that real love isn't what appears when everything is fine, but what grows when everything seems hard. The audience listened in respectful silence. Now I look around and see that our love story didn't stay just between us. It spread. Every family that thrived, every child who learned to plant, every project that succeeded, it's proof that when two people truly love each other, that love overflows and blesses everyone around them. The applause was long and heartfelt. Afterward, the celebration continued with music, dancing, and a bountiful feast prepared together by all the families. Late at night, as the party was winding down and families began heading home, Elizabeth and Michael found themselves alone in the schoolyard, still hearing echoes of music and laughter. Michael, Elizabeth said, resting her head on his shoulder. Do you think our children will understand how lucky they are to grow up in a community like this? I think they'll understand when they're older and see how different the world can be out there, he replied. But I also think they'll carry this inside them wherever they go. What do you mean? They'll know it's possible to build a better world. They'll be certain that it's worth being kind, generous, cooperative. No one can take that from them. Elizabeth smiled. You know what moves me most about this whole celebration? What? Seeing our story become an example for others. How many couples do you think will be inspired by what we've lived through to not give up on their own relationships? I don't know, Michael answered, but I hope it's many. They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms under the starry sky, thinking of how many other love stories and transformations were being written at that very moment around the world. Elizabeth, Michael said after a few moments of silence. Yes? There's something I never told you. What? She asked, curious and slightly concerned. That first time you yelled at me about the fence, when I went home that day, I told my father I'd met the angriest woman I'd ever seen in my life. Elizabeth laughed. And what did your father say? He said an angry woman is usually a wounded woman, and a wounded woman can become a strong woman if she finds someone patient enough to wait for the healing to happen. Your father is wise. He was, and he was right. You weren't angry. You were hurt. And when you healed, you discovered that beneath the anger was an incredible woman. Elizabeth turned to face him. And you had the patience to wait. Every second was worth it. They kissed, and in that kiss were 10 years of history, 2 children sleeping at home, an entire community that had grown around their love, and the promise of many more years to come. When they pulled apart, Elizabeth saw Hope and Anthony running toward them. The children had woken up and come looking for their parents. "Mom, Dad," Anthony shouted. "Old Anthony said you were here." "We are, sweetheart," Elizabeth said, opening her arms to embrace them. "Why did you take so long?" Hope asked, snuggling into her father's lap. "We were talking about how lucky we are," Michael answered. "Lucky why?" Anthony wanted to know. Elizabeth looked around, seeing the school, the community, the green fields in the distance, and finally turned her gaze to her family. "We're lucky to have each other," she said, "and to know that love always finds a way to make things right." The end of the story. And what about you, dear listener? What did you think of this tale of transformation and true love? Do you believe Elizabeth made the right choice by choosing a simple life with Michael? Share your honest thoughts in the comments. It helps us understand what you love most and create even better stories for you. Don't forget to like this video and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of the other heartfelt stories we've prepared just for you.